Live right here on Montana Talks, an expert right here in our own backyard. He's long time been one of the most popular professors on the University of Montana campus, heads up the Central and Southwest Asian Studies Center. Dr. Mehrdad Kia, always a pleasure to have you on the program. Thanks for being with us.
Good morning, Aaron. This is always a pleasure for me to be in the program with you, and we go back a long time, and I greatly appreciate everything you do for the state and for informing your audience.
Well, you're far too kind. You're far too kind. I know you got a brown bag luncheon coming up on this very topic on Monday. I wish I could be there in Missoula, but maybe some of our folks from Flathead and Missoula I know will be in attendance for that event. What's your read on the current situation right now with Turkey, Syria, the Kurds, and more?
Great question, and as you know very well, very complex question. The reason is that the Kurds are a people, non-Arab, non-Turkic people who have been divided into various countries in the region. This goes back, of course, to the shaping of the map of the region back in 1920s by the British and the French. The majority of the Kurds landed in Turkey. Today there are about 15 million of them in Turkey. They are not Turks. They don't speak Turkish, but they live under Turkish government. There is about 5 to 6 million in Iraq. There is another 5-6 million in Iran, in Western Iran. And there is about 1.5 million, at times they say 2 million, in Syria. As some of your listeners know, Kurds have been subjected to a very harsh treatment. In Iraq, as some of us remember, Saddam Hussein gassed them, actually used chemical gas to destroy their resistance against his regime. In Syria, they have been systematically suppressed by the Assad regime, and in Turkey and in Iran, their rights have been denied systematically in the past and harshly suppressed as well. So in Syria, as we all remember, in 2015, there was an effort to restart a real campaign against ISIS. There was a very slow response by the Obama administration, which proved to be very embarrassing at the time. ISIS terrorists were attacking Kurdish villages and towns, raping women, setting villages and towns on fire, looting homes, and so on and so forth, enslaving some of the Kurdish population. And the United States was very slow in responding, but slowly but surely we started in 2015, and then starting especially in 2016, and after the arrival of the Trump administration, in a much more intense fashion. And from the very beginning, when we started the fight against the ISIS terrorists on the ground in Syria, it was the Kurds who joined us and agreed to help United States efforts to dislodge and destroy ISIS bases and capture ISIS fighters. In the process, while we lost a few military personnel from the United States, the Kurdish fighters lost about 11,000 individuals. And as you know, Kurds are very egalitarian in their social mores. So women and men were fighting on the Kurdish side, and 11,000 is a large number.
Yeah, and some incredible stories of these women fighters from the Kurds as well.
Actions. I mean, some of them thought that they might be captured. They killed themselves, and they carried poison pills. They didn't want to be captured by ISIS because they're savages who might rape or kill them. So this was a sort of a heroic chapter in Kurdish history. In fact, whatever the case may be, we managed, with the help of the Kurds, to crush ISIS and to capture their capital. And today there are about 10,000 ISIS fighters, former ISIS fighters, who are in prison camps in northeastern Syria. Now, because of the small number of American military personnel, we left the responsibility for these camps to the Kurds. And the Kurds then organized themselves as Syrian Democratic Forces. So if you hear of SDF, Syrian Democratic Forces, it's basically a Kurdish force. There are no Arabs or others, maybe a few, but the Kurds dominate the force. And slowly they started creating an autonomous region in northeastern Syria with our help, which has come to be known as Rojava or Rojava, Rojava. It's south of the Turkish border, and that, of course, alarmed the Erdogan government in Turkey that the Kurds are establishing themselves as a kind of a Kurdish state. And I think that the fear of the Turkish government is that we have an autonomous region, a Kurdistan or Kurdish autonomous region in northern Iraq with the support from the United States.
You basically were saying, look, okay, we teamed up with the Kurds. We went in there to team up with the Kurds to take the fight to ISIS, to destroy the ISIS caliphate, and we did that. That while some remnants remain, we basically did that. But that situation has evolved to where now the Kurds basically developed a semi-autonomous state in northern Syria. That got the Turks concerned that, wow, now they're going to press into Turkey and try to create a semi-autonomous state into Turkey. So that's what basically caused the run-up into this news that we've seen over the past few days, where Turkey has now launched an incursion into Syria. Is that kind of a good summary?
Yeah, that's an excellent summary, Aaron. And we have to remember in that context that Turkey is probably the most anxious regime in the region with regard to the Kurds, because the largest Kurdish population in the Middle East live in Turkey, roughly 15 million. And if you have an autonomous region in Iraq, you have an autonomous state in Syria, what is next? It's the domino effect that you will have the emergence of a new country which takes away territory and resources from Turkey, Iraq, and Syria, and it will be a country of over 20 million people, roughly almost 30 million people, and situated in the heartland of the Middle East, and Turkey will not allow this to happen. And I think they made this very clear to us, that we understand the United States needed the Kurds to get rid of ISIS, but now that the ISIS has been crushed, you have to allow us to address our security concerns and establish a sort of a security zone 20 miles deep into Syrian territory and roughly 400 to 450 miles wide, so the Turkish army can come, clear the region from armed Kurdish militia, and bring back some of the refugees who have fled from Syria to Turkey and resettled them.
Which is something like 1 million refugees, I think.
There is about 3.6 million
wow.
refugees.
Yeah, but I think 1 million just from northern Syria.
It's a huge number for the Turks, and they cannot financially sustain supporting over 3 million people in temporary camps.
And all of that kind of leads to my next question, the bigger question I had this morning, which is, and I kind of mentioned this on the show earlier in the week. So last week when this story broke that the U.S. was going to be withdrawing the 50 Americans who were in that particular spot in northern Syria, the 50 Americans that were basically separating the Turks from the Kurds and the Russians and the Syrians and everything else, the two narratives that came out of the media last week in the initial coverage was the Kurds there's about to be a bloodbath. The Kurds are going to get completely annihilated by Turkey. That was one narrative. The other narrative was all of a sudden that President Trump just all of a sudden announced that this was going to happen. In reality, Turkey has been trying to do this, and the Trump administration has been holding them back for months, if not over a year, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's almost a year and a half that the Turks have been pushing. This has been a long process. This is not an overnight. And I'm sorry to say that sometimes the coverage by the media is so simplistic that they actually portray this as a phone call between the President of the United States and President of Turkey, and then suddenly the President of the United States decides, okay, we will withdraw. I think the biggest concern that we should address right now is to set aside this, partisan interpretation of the events and really look at the security of these prison camps. So far, the Kurds have held on to these prison camps where we hold ISIS fighters. But now, as we withdraw, I think it's the responsibility of the NATO countries. And I think it would be very important for your listeners to know that these folks in those prison camps, these terrorists, are not from Moon or Mars. Many of them, thousands of them, are European Muslims. They are British, they are French, they are Belgian, they're German. And they came from the back streets of Paris and London and Berlin to fight a holy war against the Assad regime in Syria and to wreak havoc against U.S. interest in the region.
And the Europeans refused to take them back and to take custody of the prisoners that came from their own countries.
Exactly, and this is the irony, and this is the hypocrisy of our so-called European allies. With these European allies, I mean, if with friends like this, who needs enemies? And the British and the French and the Germans and the Belgians and others are basically saying, well, this is your problem. No, it is your problem because these are your nationals. And you have to assume some responsibility in terms of either taking them back, putting them through a legal process, putting them in jail. They cannot be freed because they will be very dangerous. And if you don't want them to return to UK and France and Germany and Belgium, you have a responsibility to somehow respond to this urgent need. The Kurds are worried that if the Turkish forces reach, the area of the prison camps, they have to withdraw, and the prison camps will then be exposed to, sort of escapees and so on and so forth. And that's one thing that they want to avoid. And I understand their concern. And at this point, I think it's extremely important that Europe jumps in, NATO jumps in, and that Turkey also shows a real responsible approach by not allowing any ISIS fighters to flee and wreak havoc later on.
Yeah, and that's of course one of the main concerns is preventing mass escapes from ISIS detainees. That's one. The other is hey, look, I get it that the Kurds in northern Syria are different than the Kurds in northern Iraq and different than the Kurds in Iran and elsewhere, but we still see the Kurds as our friend. They've been our friends in northern Syria. They've been teaming up with us, so we definitely want to see our friends the Kurds protected. But I think that's why a lot of folks may have been surprised. Wow, that was fast. I mean, earlier this week, we already saw that basically a deal had been brokered between the Kurds and between the Assad regime. And it's like, well, that didn't just happen in the last 3 or 4 days. There was obviously talks already underway, I'm assuming, before something like that were to happen. And then, too, we saw that instead of 50 Americans being the referees between the Turks and the Kurds, that now the Russians are basically patrolling that line to protect the Kurds. And so there's a lot more complexity to this story than the media is giving to it. And I think that also tells us that, hey, look, this narrative that the Kurds are going to get annihilated it ignores a true understanding of that region.
Exactly. And it might be of some interest also to your listeners to learn that, in fact, it was the Russian government which began negotiations between the Syrian regime, because they are backing the Assad regime, and the Kurds, and try to act as the mediator and use the opportunity of the Turkish invasion to convince the Kurds that you have to return to an alliance with Assad. Though Assad has not been nice to you and has been, in fact, very oppressive, it's a much better option than the Turkish military coming to your villages and towns. So with guarantees that the Syrian regime will stay within the margins of Kurdish towns and villages, the Russians are trying to broker a deal between the Assad government in Damascus and the Kurds, who are feeling very exposed and vulnerable to attacks by Turkey.
Well, it's also interesting, too, that now we've got a Republican president who's saying we don't need these forever wars. We can't keep our troops over there in perpetuity as in places like Syria and elsewhere. But yet the Democrat presidential candidates, it's like the tables have flipped here. They're defending forever wars and defending keeping troops over there in perpetuity. And my question is, okay, if they don't support what President Trump is trying to do here and the complexity of this situation that he's dealing with, what's their answer? I mean, do they want to continue to try to go after Assad? Do they want to continue to broaden and get into a broader civil war in Syria? Do they want us serving as the referees between the Turks, the Syrians, and the Kurds and the Russians?
My understanding is even as early as the 2016 election, and people I don't think realize this. Hillary Clinton's campaign actually had a very sort of complex and detailed schedule and program to actually become fully involved militarily in Syria. And we should not forget that Secretary Clinton had a very hawkish, in fact, foreign policy with regard to Syria, and wanted to increase the number of U.S. troops on the ground. By all objective measures, however, as you mentioned correctly, Syria is not of any strategic interest to the United States, either because of lack of economic resources or just simply because it's a violent civil war in which, millions of people have lost their homes, if not lives. So to become involved, we became involved to get rid of ISIS and also to make sure that we collaborate with the government of Israel to contain Iranian expansion in Syria.
Dr. Kia, greatly appreciate your time this morning. If maybe just a final question for you here before our next guest joins us on the show. What are you going to be looking for in the coming days or in the coming months? What's the next question that we all need to be asking and looking at regarding this whole situation, Turkey, Syria, and the Kurds?
Excellent question, Aaron. I think we should first and foremost make sure that the prison camps where the ISIS terrorists are being held will remain secure, and I think we should do everything in our power to pressure the government of Turkey, and I think the Trump administration is doing the same thing. I understand there is constant conversation and communication, including Vice President Pence, who will talk to President Erdogan of Turkey, that we now hold Turkey responsible for maintaining security and protection of those prison camps. That's one thing. We do not want any terrorists to escape those prison camps and use the chaos on the ground in Syria to come west, to come to Europe and, God forbid, United States later. One. And the second thing, I think the security of our allies in the region, especially the security of Israel, is paramount. We have to make sure that the Iranian and Russian sort of military presence does not pose a security threat to the Israeli borders in Lebanon and Syria. And then finally, I would say that we have to work with our European allies and Turkey to make sure that the refugee issue is actually gradually and slowly resolved in the coming months.
All right. Dr. Mehrdad Kia, always a pleasure. Great to talk with you, sir. Thanks so much for your time this morning.
Thank you very much, Aaron.